Now, we have all watched Vivian's work. I could read your bio in a formal sense, or I could tell you about the dirt that I found out on you last night. There is none. I desperately tried with her as well, impenetrable. Vivian is recognised for her leadership in evidence-informed policy and practice and fostering equity in grant-making and in the movement to democratise evidence. Prior to her current role, Vivian led initiatives to connect research, policy and practice as Senior Vice President of Programs at the William T. Grant Foundation. She has spoken and published widely, I can't say that word, you guys get it, on racial, cultural and immigration influences on child development, has developed funding programs to support researchers and leaders from minority and underrepresented communities, and has mentored countless junior colleagues across her career. She has come from a very long way, and we know how that is, so we very much appreciate your time. If you could come up. Perfect. Vivian, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Robin, for that lovely introduction. I just want you to know, Robin, that you will not need to stand up because I'm starting my stopwatch, okay. So I will be pacing myself. Let's see how we go. It's truly an honor to be here, and I'm actually quite humbled to be here this week. I've taken the opportunity to try to learn as much as I can. It's been like a crash course in learning about the referendum. And I just want to say that I am actually quite in awe and inspired by what's being put, this historic vote that's being put before the Australian people. And I'm really in awe of the decades of activism and struggle that has led up to it. I think that has been so impressive, and something I will definitely be taking back with me to the U.S. Okay, you need some help? Nope, I got it. So I'm also humbled to be here because, as I understand it, this is, as Robin said, the first time, but there's been at least an in-person coming together of folks since the pandemic began. And that's a lot of where I want to sort of start my story and my talk, because I think we have come out of an enormous crisis, a global pandemic that we have not seen in a century, right? So in our lifetimes, we have not seen this kind of crisis. And for us in the U.S., and I think for many folks around the world, the timing of the pandemic also coincided as we were locked down with a time of serious racial reckoning. And so it was a period where the vast inequalities globally and certainly domestically within the U.S. became more visible to us. I want to be clear, I'm not saying that it was new, but I think it became much more visible to us, and in some instances even widened during the pandemic. And so I come to you here today with a different kind of talk than I usually give. This is not a talk where I've thought everything through and I'm going to end it with a set of recommendations. This is really a talk about my emergent thinking, because I have come out of this period of these last few years asking myself some very hard fundamental questions about why we do the work that we do and how we do it. And so a lot of the talk I'm going to give you today is my emergent thinking and the evolution of my thinking, and also the questions that I'm raising. And I hope that they're also helpful for you as you think about your work coming out of the pandemic in the last few years. I always like to locate myself. Let's see here. How do I advance the slides?
Yep.
Okay. Number one, learn how to advance your slides. So, as Robin mentioned, I spent many, many years at the William T. Grant Foundation. I'm actually newly now at a new organization called the Foundation for Child Development as its new president and CEO. We are an organization that's almost 125 years old. So in the U.S. context, that's very, very old. Our organization started out as a charity in the progressive era, and a charity that provided services for children who are marginalized in society. Today, we're a private foundation, and we work at the nexus of research, policy, and practice to bring about equity for young children. So because I started this job about a year ago, and we're also coming out of the last few years of the pandemic and a racial reckoning, you're also catching me at a time of a lot of transition and questioning, as I mentioned before. So really, I'm here today to share with you the journey that I've been on and to invite you to join me as part of this journey. And I hope that while I will share with you my thinking, I am looking forward to even more learning from you and hearing about how you are thinking about these issues in your own work going forward. So the WHO estimates officially 7 million deaths from the pandemic over the last 3 years. They recognize this is probably a gross undercount, and they put the real estimate, what they call excess deaths, as closer to 15 million deaths around the world. In the United States, my country, we hit this remarkable point in 2022 where we had hit the 1 million mark in terms of deaths. It's one of the highest death tolls of any wealthy nation. And of course, the pandemic did not affect everyone equally. In the US, we saw stark racial and ethnic disparities in infection rates and in death rates. And while we did make some ground over time, there are still racial disparities such as Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people were much more likely to be infected and die from COVID-19. And we especially saw that during the spikes when infection rates go up, because then you see who's most vulnerable in society. So, and in all sorts of ways, I'm sure you experienced it here in Australia too, during that shutdown, we really saw how vulnerable certain communities were in terms of just anything you can think about. Healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of employment, in terms of housing, senior care, almost any area that you looked at, we could see the vast inequalities in our society. They just became so vivid and so clear during this period. For us in the United States, we talked a lot all of a sudden about essential workers. I don't know if that's a term that's familiar to you. Essential workers were the people who had to keep working, while some of us who were privileged enough with professional jobs to be able to work from home. The essential workers stocked our grocery store shelves, they delivered food, they worked in senior care facilities, taking care of other people's parents, they worked in child care facilities, taking care of other people's children. And these folks were predominantly people of color. They were predominantly immigrants. They were all low-income workers working in jobs with the least protection, and I mean least protection in terms of jobs, least protection in terms of health and safety. They were also more likely to be living in larger households. So they were also, as they went out to work so that the rest of us could be at home in lockdown, living with the fear of what they were bringing back into their families. And so there was for a while this respect, this sort of appreciation for essential workers. I'm sorry to say that a lot of that has kind of died down, that reverence for them. During the pandemic, for us, was really wrapped up in a time of racial reckoning. We shut down in March of 2020. By the summer, just a few months later, with George Floyd, this is George Floyd with his daughter, Gianna, was murdered by Minneapolis police. And of course, it didn't end there. Those of us at home watched a constant, persistent barrage of anti-Black violence. Much of it state-sanctioned, committed by the police. And again, nothing new in our country, but we were all at home in lockdown watching it, and it felt really relentless. Soon thereafter, on January of 2021, we had a white supremacist insurrection at our nation's capital, something no one had ever seen in our country's history. breaching the walls, breaching into the inner chambers, into congressmen and congresswomen's offices, desecrating them, carrying Nazi paraphernalia, a noose, and waving the Confederate flag inside of the Capitol building. Something that never even happened during the Civil War, by the way. So we really saw in that moment the strength of the white power movement in the United States, which itself had been growing for decades. And we also, at the same period of time, saw a rising tide of anti-Asian violence, which again is not new. It's been pervasive throughout our history, but it became more visible and it also became more extreme. Here is a photo of Hyung Young Grant, also with her 2 sons. She was an Asian woman killed alongside 5 other Asian women in a shooting in Atlanta, Georgia. And it wasn't surprising, actually, that there was a rise in anti-Asian violence over the last few years when you have President Trump and other politicians talking about the coronavirus as the China virus and about the virus killing real Americans, right? And that had been brought over by the Chinese. It was also a period, though, I would say, of great inspiration to me. Even in the darkest moments, there was also moments of great inspiration. We saw mass protests of size and scale that we had not seen in a generation. Not since the Civil Rights Movement have we seen mass public protests like the Black Lives Matter protests. And so for a time, the racial injustices in our society became so widely recognized. And you would walk down buildings, including in Washington, D.C., and there would be huge banners coming off of government buildings and other buildings that Black Lives Matter. And frankly, that was not something I thought I would ever see in my lifetime. And then as anti-Asian violence rose, I would say we also saw some wonderful acts of multiracial solidarity, where Asian Americans, even as they were fearing for vigilante violence against them, were also being careful not to call for more policing, which would have negative impact on Black communities. And so really you saw some wonderful instances, I wish there were more, but of multiracial solidarity and coming together. And so that was really inspiring to me in these dark times. I think another thing that inspires me and brings me hope is this young generation of scholars that I've been privileged to work with. This is Carolyn Barnes. She is a faculty member at Duke University. And what I've seen in this generation of young scholars is an enormous sense of like, we are not going to keep working in the status quo in the academy, that we want to do work that matters in the world, and the academy better change with us or we're going to leave, right? And I know there's always been individuals like that within the academy, there still are, but I've never seen this kind of, this rising tide and with such ferocity and such courage that we're seeing in this new generation of academics, and they gave me great hope. What also gives me great hope is that we're seeing in the US and across the world university leaders who are also starting, again, it's not normative, but we're starting to see more of them speak out about the role of universities and how important it is for universities to also create social impact in the broader world. And they're thinking hard about ways that they can help move some of their incentive systems, their academic cultures, to enable the young academics like Carolyn to thrive in these settings, not just survive by doing this work in the academy, but actually to thrive. So I think there's also a lot of reason for hope and inspiration. But all of this work has also had me thinking a lot about democratizing evidence. And this is a concept that colleagues and I started to think about, frankly, after the 2016 presidential election in the United States, which felt like a huge political crisis to me and to many of my colleagues when Donald Trump was elected. And the basic idea behind democratizing evidence, it is not complicated. It's a very basic idea. The idea is that we apply basic concepts of democracy to the work of producing evidence and using evidence. It's actually quite simple. But it's remarkable when you think about the evidence-based policy movement, or even, I would say, the evidence-informed policy work, the evidence-informed practice work, how often that work has tended to be more top-down, that has not always really infused some democratic principles. I've written a lot and talked a lot about our evidence-based policy movement in the U.S., and I've been quite critical of it because it has been extremely top-down. At times I've argued that it even represents more of an oligarchy than a representative democracy. We saw a movement that was driven a lot by government, federal government, making decisions about what kinds of research was needed, and pressing down into states and communities. And so agendas were largely shaped by what people in local communities would consider elites, right? Elites off in Washington, D.C., elites as policymakers, elites also in terms of researchers, right? And I consider myself as among these elites, right? Those of us who are very highly educated and making important decisions. And even beyond the evidence-based policy movement, which was remarkable in many ways, it captured a lot of ground in 20 years. But well beyond that, there's a longer arc of history of academia and the research community behaving in very top-down ways, and also being the ones to set research agendas, right? So characteristically, many of you probably, I certainly know I was trained so that how do you develop your next research project? You go and you read the research literature, you figure out where are the gaps, and you go off and you develop your next study. We learned a lot about how to advance academia based on what already existed in academia and based on our conversations with each other. And so, of course, that kind of trend has been critiqued for many years. I'm certainly not the first. I won't be the last to talk about it. You know, people have characterized it as drive-by research, too, when academics come in, drive into a community, collect data, and then drive right back out, not leaving anything of significant value behind. You've heard about it as parachute research, parachuting into communities and leaving. My colleagues in the environmental community talk about it as extractive research, extracting resources and not returning. And in the U.S., and I think in other parts of the world, as I've talked to colleagues, this has often fomented a lot of distrust of the evidence movement because it has been very top-down. It has not always deeply engaged people from the bottom up. And so the idea of democratizing evidence is then quite simply, how do we think about turning some of this on its head? How do we think about infusing some basic principles of democracy into the ways in which we go about our work, producing evidence and using evidence? I've been thinking about it in terms of some design principles for our own work at the Foundation for Child Development. You know, I have the great pleasure and honor of leading a new organization, and that's always a great opportunity to rethink, right? Open things up and think about how we might do things differently. And so I've been thinking about three principles, in which I'll share with you today. One is about centering communities. The second is about embracing history. And the third is about contending with power. So first, I'm thinking about ways of democratizing evidence that center communities that are marginalized by oppression. Now, at the Foundation for Child Development, our anchor are children, particularly young children. And at the center of our interests, as we think about our agenda going forward, we're concerned about young children who are marginalized by racism, by xenophobia, and by economic inequality. We feel a sense of moral urgency around this issue, but it's also, I think, a very practical concern. In the United States, children of color are already half of the U.S. population, and we have an aging white population. So as you start to think about demographically, who is the U.S. becoming, and what do we need to be preparing for, it is this group of young children. And when you're concerned about young children, their parents and their families become very important as well. It's a little different. I came from the world of studying adolescents and young adults. But when you think about young children, their well-being is so intimately tied to the well-being of their parents and their caregivers. And so it really is incumbent upon us to really care for also their parents, not just the kids, but their parents. So this might sound so intuitive to you. Why am I even bringing this up? Well, I bring it up because it's striking how rarely we've really centered communities marginalized by oppression in our evidence work. Even today, research is still primarily conducted on white populations. We sit on bodies of research that are primarily not about communities marginalized by oppression. Certainly that has changed in decades, right? In recent decades, that has shifted. But too often, even that research has tended to be deficit-oriented. It has too often cast racial and ethnic minorities, cast immigrants in terms of having deficits and deviances with the implication that they need to be fixed. Research is often too victim-blaming as well. And when it comes to young children, often blaming their parents, blaming parents of color, blaming low-income parents for making poor choices, for lack of motivation, lack of effort, for their children's disadvantages. My colleague Eve Tuck also calls out that there's a lot of damage-centered research, too. That this is research where it's motivated by this idea of, wanting to counter inequality, wanting to counter oppression, but we do it by trying to document people's pain and their brokenness. And so the research is centered a lot on their damage. And she argues that when we do that, what we do is we end up, while highlighting oppression and inequality, we also end up reinforcing the notion of these communities as depleted, ruined, and hopeless. And so while research on children and families of color has grown, seldom are those studies guided by the goals that those communities have for themselves. I'll say that again. Too seldom are those studies guided by the goals that communities have for themselves. So if this starts to sound like the concept of self-determination, well, I think it is. And I think it's no surprise that Eve Tuck is an Indigenous scholar. And so I would just emphasize that even as we're increasing research about communities, we should also be thinking more about whether the research is shaped by communities. It can be about communities, but not necessarily shaped by them. When we have bodies of research that are about communities and not shaped by them, what we risk is paternalism. What we risk is presuming to know what communities need better than they do. And so what I've been thinking a lot about with my colleagues is how do we apply, again, some of these basic democratic principles to the ways in which we go about setting evidence use and evidence production agendas. How do we center community perspectives at the agenda setting table on the very front end? How do we engage communities in this messy democratic process of deliberating, negotiating, and compromising over evidence agendas, over what types of evidence are needed, why they're needed, how are they going to be put to use? And beyond the production of evidence, I'm thinking a lot about the use of evidence and thinking about how important it is for us, for communities, to have access to data and research evidence. I've written a lot. I'm part of the problem. Let me just start by saying that. I've written an awful lot about how to make sure that evidence is useful to, accessible to policymakers and practitioners. But here I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about it also, not instead of, also being accessible to communities. And I'm using the word accessible, not available, because I'm drawing a cautionary statement from something that I've seen in the US, which is this push around open science. I think it's part of a trend around open science to bring down paywalls so that academic journal articles supported by federal funding is made publicly available. Now, I think that that's all well and good, but if the concern is about making evidence accessible and usable to the public, then academic journals simply are not going to get us there, right? And so I'm thinking a lot about what does it mean when we make evidence accessible to communities. And I include their data. One of my colleagues has talked a lot about, if you think about our social services data systems, right, the data that we collect, think about who contributes to that data, but then who gets to use it and even see it. And who's locked out of even having lines of sight into the data that's being collected on them. And to even leverage that to think about how they would want to improve services. So that's part of what I'm thinking about in terms of democratizing evidence. In addition to accessibility, we're thinking a lot about how to equip communities to use evidence. So it's one thing to have access to it, to be able to interpret it. It's another thing to be able to wield it as a tool, right? And I've written a lot, over the years about, how the need to build capacity for policymakers, build capacity for practitioners to use evidence. I think what we need to think more about is how to equip communities to also do that, so they can also wield it as a tool of decision-making, as a tool of advocacy. And then third, I think we need to think more about how to create well-designed opportunities for public deliberation over evidence. Because evidence, if there's one thing we've learned about evidence use, evidence never speaks for itself. Evidence is not just some kind of isolated fact that people need to apply. Evidence always needs to be interpreted in terms of what does it mean for the problem before us now, what are the implications of it, and so how do we create well-designed opportunities for that interpretation to take place? And it is deliberation among groups of people is what we're talking about. So how do we create those settings and those processes for that to occur? My hope is that if we can do all this, and it will be a long time horizon for this, we can foster a more evidence-informed citizenry. One that can turn around and hold government and service providers more accountable for its use, non-use, or misuse of evidence. A second principle that I have been thinking deeply about is embracing historical perspectives and embracing our history with courage and with humility. I've been so influenced by John Diamond. He's a sociologist of educational inequality in the United States. He's done a lot of partnership work with communities and with schools, and he's just an incredibly thoughtful observer of the field. And one of the things John reminds us of as we go about partnership work and as we go about collaboration work is to remember that the institutions engaged in those collaborations have long histories of racial injustice that we need to recognize. That universities, for example, sit on land acquired through theft, conquest, and genocide. That universities are built on the proceeds of slavery and of the exploitive taxation of Chinese laborers. Long histories of academic knowledge being produced extractively. And he calls on us to also think not just of universities as institutions, but we could also start to think, for him, he worked a lot with schools, thinking about schools and education agencies themselves as sites of historical exclusion. For most of American history, Black, Asian, and Latino children were segregated from white children. Indigenous children in our country, and I know in Australia here, were sent to residential schools that were intentionally designed to separate them from family members and were intended to erase their cultures and languages. And today we still see traces of that. We just see that segregation and exclusion has taken on new and different forms of pushing out kids from high schools, of racial disparities in school discipline, which start almost from the beginning of schooling. We start to see vast racial disparities, which is quite shocking. So we see that in the agencies that we work with. When we think about governments as partners and collaborators, we also have to recognize the long histories of racially exclusionary laws and policies and anti-immigrant laws and policies. Foundations, my sector. We recognize that where do foundations start? Foundations start from wealth, right? Wealth that was accumulated often on the backs of low-income folks, on the backs of immigrants, on the backs of people of color. And that even while today foundations like mine seek to be of service, we've also had long institutional histories of paternalism, of charity work towards the less advantaged. And so FCD, as we do our look back, is thinking hard about our 125-year history, trying to be very clear-eyed about our founding during the progressive era and the evolution of the way our organization has thought about and talked about children at the margins of society as the disadvantaged, and shifting some of our thinking more to thinking about structural inequality and about advancing social justice for young children. Now, I feel like I've just provided you with a litany of examples. It's a little depressing. And I do it, and that's not even exhaustive, right? I know you're probably all sitting there and you have other examples. And my intent was not to be exhaustive. My intent was just to make the basic point that racial injustice is so pervasive across all of our institutions, that it's deeply embedded, it goes quite deep within our institutions, that it doesn't just live in the past, it lives on today, and that the imprint of history marks all of us, not just folks of color. Are you serious?
I don't want to, I know.
Oh, my Lord.
I know.
But this says I have 10 minutes.
I don't want to do this.
Do I really have 10 minutes? Okay. Do I have 10 minutes?
Remember, yep.
Okay.
If you don't want anyone to ask you any questions.
Okay. Oh.
So like,
Oh. Dang. Sorry. You know what? This went much more quickly in my hotel room, so I do apologize. I did time myself several times. Let me get back to this, about the need to embrace history, and I'm going to pick up the pace now. What are the implications for democratizing evidence? Anne Ishimaru, an education scholar in the US, really encourages researchers. She does this call to action to researchers, and she says, please don't fall into lockstep and unquestioningly align our research goals with existing system goals and assumptions. Don't do it unquestioningly. Don't just fall into lockstep. Instead, she really calls on us to enlist communities and families as partners in redefining the goals of research, that together we could maybe challenge some of the institutional injustices and reimagine them what research can accomplish. All of this requires building trust. And here, trust is never something that's built once. It's not a one-and-done activity. And here, I hope that we can start to think more and more about long-term commitments. It takes a long time to build trust. It's taken a long time to create mistrust. And so we're fighting against a history of drive-by research, of extractive research. And so, how can we bring more fortitude into some longer-term relationships and show that we can stay with communities, stay with them, stand shoulder to shoulder with them to address complex, hard problems over time, and that we will not just be driving through their communities. Okay, I'm going to whip through this one really quickly. The third thing is I'm asking us to think very specifically about power imbalances and really pay close attention to them. I love this quote for John Diamond. He reminds us that bringing groups and institutions with unequal power together without acknowledging that unequal power is a recipe for continued domination. It's a recipe for continued domination. And so as we collaborate across professional roles and communities, and in some ways, when Robin put up her slide about who's here in the room, a lot of this, she divided us up by our professional roles, right? So we are institutional actors. We are institutional agents. And let's think about that. What does that mean in terms of the power and privilege that we bring to these tables of collaboration? The resources that we bring from our universities, the expertise, the gatekeeping, the authority. I know some of us don't feel very powerful in our institutions sometimes, but we do. We do carry quite a bit of power that can very easily drown out the voices and the power of communities. And so how do we act very intentionally to work together by defining our roles, the activities, the decision-making processes to really contend with power imbalances. I'm actually, because I do want to save some time for discussion, going to wrap up just by saying, I started by just telling you that I'm on a journey. I was not going to end a talk with a set of recommendations, so there's no recommendation slides. But I'm on a journey. These are very much emergent ideas that I'm sharing with you and emergent questions. And I really hope to learn from all of you over the next few days about how you're thinking about it. I know some of you are already working on these issues, and that it's not new to you. And I hope to learn from you and also to think with you so we can walk this road together. Thank you.
Stay here. We've got time for maybe 2 questions. You'll have to, I can project.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm thinking we've got mics. Is that right? Run, humans. See, there's someone right there. Go, Karen, go. Well, don't run and you hurt yourself. Also, for those of you online, if you can, For those of you online that can hear me, please post your questions. I've got a tablet in my hand and I can read them out.
Yes.
You talk about trust building. You've nailed some trust building for me in starting this conference for us. I work in philanthropy as a funder, and we are exploring all of these issues in the ways that we work with the communities that we aim to support. How do we measure trust, and how do we measure the impact of the power imbalance that we create?
Yeah. I think there's certainly a whole body of academic literature, if we want to get nerdy about it. There's a whole body of academic literature about how you measure trust. I would particularly point to work on relational trust. I think in less nerdy ways, we could think about things like, do people keep showing up? Do they keep returning, right? And do they show satisfaction, and commitment to the joint work, right? I think that is an indication of trust. One other thing I'll say about trust is it's usually, at least as I've seen in research practice partnerships, it's not like trust goes like this, right? It kind of goes, and then maybe it takes a dip at some point because trust is breached somehow, usually not intentionally, and it has to be rebuilt. And so I think as we measure it and think about that, especially as funders, we need to be ready for this, some rockiness, right? And so investing some in the front end in planning, right? And maybe when trust starts to go down, maybe that's when we should increase our investments, right? Maybe there's more we should be doing to help support people in building stronger trust. So hopefully what comes out is a rebound, right, that comes up even higher.
Okay, we have time for one more. Oh, really? Fair enough. Go ahead. Andrew, please.
Andrew Malat from the University of Sydney, but formerly a bureaucrat in New South Wales Government. Just thinking about your program of work, and the types of research that you're doing, what would be sort of a couple of practical things that you're doing to change the research that you do and in terms of gauging communities and democratising the evidence that you produce through your centre?
Okay, so I am new, so I can't tell you what I've done, but I'll tell you what I'm thinking about. And of course, these are not decisions that I will make on my own. I'll be making them in conjunction with our board and our staff. But I'll tell you what I'm thinking about. We have a Young Scholars program where we nurture the next generation of young scholars, folks that kind of like, I have Carolyn Barnes in my head, of folks like that. I'm thinking a lot about how we can support and nurture a young generation of scholars to build long-term relationships with community organizers and social movements. And how we can support them not just to do the work, but how can we support them to have successful careers doing the work so that they will stay with this work? And how can we wrap supports around them to ensure that they can be successful if they stay in the academy doing this work? So caring both for them as they do the work and their ability to build these long standing relationships. I think other things that we're thinking about in terms of, we haven't gotten to a stage yet of setting our own research agenda, but what we're trying to do right now is to engage in a lot of inclusive dialogue. And that inclusivity also includes different types of researchers. Researchers that have not traditionally been at the center of early childhood research. There's researchers who do critical race theory, sociologists, thinking very broadly about different types of researchers to bring to the conversation, but of course not just researchers, and bringing to the table folks who are organizing parents, for example, organizing caregivers, folks who I think of as sort of on the front lines of trying to engage communities and build power among communities to create the kind of change they want to see. So that's where we're at this stage.
Thank you very much. Very grateful for that, and what a way to start.